Winters surrounding the lumber camps in Port Huron could be very severe. But it looked like this day was a mild day. They came out with this photograph. But most of the time they were inside, like this photograph here, sitting around a fire and trying to keep warm. And it would appear there's something cooking on that fire. But for the working lumberjack, winter was no different than spring or summer. They worked just as hard in the winter time and faced more challenges probably. And from this short video you can see that they're still cutting down trees and burning off calories. After the timber was cut, they would load up the sleds with the timber, and the horses would struggle to pull it. I would imagine it doesn't look like there's much snow or ice in this photo, so it would have been pretty tough for them. And it was a pretty heavy load, it looks like. But they would take it down to the river, and if the ice was thick enough, they would unload it right on the river, and if not, they would load it very close to the river. And eventually, Black River would be just filled to capacity with logs, sometimes going down 3 or 4 foot deep, sometimes even to the bottom. And then once the ice melted, the water would lift the logs and they began floating. And they would put in these wooden booms that would keep the logs in until they were ready to drive the logs downstream. Here we see the river drivers getting ready for the drive. And then once they started, they would situate the logs, try to get as many from the banks as possible, and wait for that big moment when the drive would start. Of course, they had river drivers that weren't quite as experienced, still in training, as you see in this photograph here. Future river drivers. There was an ideal time for starting the drive, and that time was when all the snow had melted, and the ice had melted, and the river was as high as possible. But there was one more thing that they had to do, and that was to open the slash dams, or the sluice dams. The loggers would dam up the creeks that went into Black River, at the tributaries that went into Black River. And when those creeks were as high as possible, that's when they would open the sluice dams. And the rush of water coming in would jumpstart pushing those logs downstream. And that's when the drivers really had their work cut out for them. But you can see here in this film clip the water coming through the dam. You can see the force that would be pushing down the river. And as the logs cleared the river, they'd have these men here pushing the rest of the logs into the river. Occasionally the logs would get hung up, and here you see a couple of loggers in a boat. This boat has a line hooked to it because it's in a very precarious place, and they're trying to dislodge the logs there without, getting in the water up to their neck. Here we see the logs flowing pretty nicely down the river, and here we see the men trying to push more logs into the river as the other ones are clearing out. And this wasn't an easy job. Right here you see 4 men trying to get this one log into the river. And here we see a little testimony to their agility. And these fellows would take their pick poles and just walk on the log like it was the sidewalk. That's amazing. They wore these special boots that you see here. One logger wrote that his feet were always wet, and at nighttime he didn't take his boots off because sometimes when they put it out into the cold and in the floor, they would freeze, and then he couldn't get them back on in the morning. The less experienced men the lumber company hired would be on the shore trying to get these logs moving into the river. But the expert, you can see him out there in the vest. He wasn't afraid of anything. He would just walk out into the logs and then start pushing whatever way he wanted to go. As the water from the sluice dams lost its power, the river went down a little bit, and of course it hung up, logs would hang up on the rocks, and here we see some fellows trying to get it off. So eventually you had to get into the water, it looks like, and I imagine it was pretty cold. Well, once the drive started, you had the men along the shore pushing and getting those logs into the river, and you had these other fellows, these river drivers, guiding the logs down to Port Huron. At some point in time, the logging companies started sending their logs down in the form of rafts. I believe it was because the boaters complained probably about some of the damage the logs were doing to their boats. And farmers, I know for sure, in other areas, I'm not sure about Black River, were suing the lumber companies because when they opened up those sluice dams, the river was already high from the winter runoff. And this would cause more runoff onto their farmland. And so there was a lot of suits going on at the time. Whether this happened on Black River or not, I'm not sure. Sometimes the logs were simply chained together and sent downriver. Other times the lumber company would build these cradles for the logs, and it was easier to keep the logs together, and you can see them putting the logs inside this cradle. And they would fasten these by various means, and you can see them working here on the logs. And then eventually the cradle would be open once they were secured, and you can see the raft there already floating. So it was another way to get the logs downstream. You would only be able to use rafts like this in the deeper parts of the river. For those loggers that were a long distance from the mill, they had chuck wagons that went with them, just like the cattle drives. And here you see one of these chuck wagons. They had the cooking tent. Sometimes they would have sleeping facilities, or at least the tents they could sleep along the shoreline. This photo here is looking west off the Military Street Bridge. And you can see one of these rafts coming downstream. No matter how the logs got to Port Huron, the first mill they would have came to on the south side of Black River is this mill here, F.L. Wells. I wanted to show you this drawing here because of the fact to the left you see that there was a creek coming into Black River, Indian Creek. And it looked like it was a pretty good sized creek. Here you see it coming off Black River, and it looks like that the first part of it anyway stayed between 10th and 11th. Here's a Google map shot that gives you an idea where the mill was and also where the creek was. First sawmill on the north side of the river they would have came to would have been the F.J. Haynes Mill, and that would have been between 7th and 10th Street. Notice where it says lumber dock. Right in that area there, actually in the river side of the lumber dock, there was booms placed that separated the logs from the hardwoods from the pines. And they're a little different than the boom that we saw upriver. They were not quite as heavy, but they made a good separator. And I believe this photo right here is looking toward the 10th Street Bridge. And on the right would be the Haynes Mill, and you can see the booms out there separating the different types of wood. And these booms also act like a floating dam. They would come out into the river to actually stop the logs coming downriver, and then the river drivers would put them into the proper places. Some of these booms would actually have little rudders on them, and the current would hold them in place. On this photo of Howard's sawmill, you can see the booms in place, and they are completely filled with logs in that one section. And it's just like on a cattle drive. They would drive their steers into the corral, and the river drivers would drive the logs into these boom docks. Once the logs were in position, the sawmill workers would take over and position the different logs for whatever type of wood they were cutting. If they were doing hardwood, then of course they would get the oak and walnut logs properly placed so they could go up the logway. In this particular photo you can see the logway, and it looks like they're taking up two at a time. In this next film clip, you'll see the inside workings of a sawmill. This one here is a steam mill, and Howard's sawmill is also a steam mill. The steam mill gave a wonderful opportunity for increased production. It became as close to an assembly line as possible. And here you can see these logs going up the logway. This isn't the Howard mill, but it certainly could have been. A lot of similarities between this mill and the Howard mill. So let's take a peek inside the mill and see what there is here. If you notice here, the log kicker is kicking the log off the logway into the bandsaw carriage. This was a steam mill, so you had this kind of production in a steam mill. The carriage went back and forth and the bandsaw did the cutting. You can see him lifting over and turning it around for another cut. The bandsaw was huge. You'll see the blade in just a minute. Here we see 16-inch pine boards coming off the live roll. And the next thing it has to go through is the edger. The edger is a saw used to straighten and smooth rough lumber, or if the stock is bowed, by making a cut along the sides of the boards. Next it goes through the trimmer. You can see it trimming the edges off here to bring it to the proper dimension. Henry Ford would have been proud of this assembly line. Here you see 10 by 12 lumber coming off the line that was used in bridge supports, very similar to what would have been on the original Military Street Bridge. Here we see the workers making shingles. And they do it pretty quickly. This is what would have been on all the roofs in the 1800s in downtown Port Huron, or even in the residential sections. Here you see him cutting the edging that came off the boards to make lath. And then you see him here putting them in bundles and tightening them up for shipment. They didn't waste anything. Even the sawdust was used in steam mills to use as fuel. Here you'll get a look at this bandsaw blade. It's huge. It was 48 feet long and 9 inches wide. And you can see him taking one off the saw that was dulled. And they pick up another one and they bring it back a saw. This one's already been sharpened on the grinder. And here we see the grinding machine doing its job on each tooth of the saw. It was quite a process, and sometimes had to be overseen by this man here to make sure that everything ran smoothly. It was quite a trick to get a bandsaw to run perfectly smooth. And he did a good job, I guess. Here we see them outside the sawmill preparing to load the lumber on a ship. It was a schooner in those days, and you'll get a look at it in just a second. They're piling it up here, getting ready to load. When the schooner came in, they would load her up. And again, I think there's a lot of similarities between the Howard mill and this mill here, just in the positioning of where the schooner would be and the lumber would be, and even the lath where it was the same at the Howard mill. And here you see them loading the lath. It looks like for local delivery. They have it all bundled up, ready to go. And I just think this is an amazing piece of film history. Here we see them sorting the lumber for delivery. And shortly we'll see it being loaded on the schooner. And here's the schooner that it was loaded on. And Howard Mill had been situated very similar. The schooners would have came right up from St. Clair River, parked alongside the Howard Mill. And I'm sure it was a common sight to see them loading those schooners up in those days. And as we see this tug pulling the schooner out into the river, I can't help to think about this photograph here, and perhaps if that wasn't a schooner that had just stopped at the Howard Mill and now is being on its way for delivery. In our next video, we'll see how the mobile steam engines affected the lumber mills, being portable and all. And then we'll also look at some of the roads they made out of logs. And then we'll see, lastly, what happened to the lumber industry and why did it disappear.